All right, we are good to go. So if I pause in the middle of this conversation, it's just to admit other students as they come in. I'm not expecting a huge turnout today because it is technically a holiday, but I really wanted to, I wanted to do this for you so that you would be prepared as best as possible for tomorrow's quiz. Tomorrow when I do a Zoom meeting, it's not going to cover any material that will be on that quiz. So today I'm going to try to get through the rest of the integumentary system so that you have a good handle on what I think is most important. So I have a checklist of things that I want, topics I want to talk about, and then I jotted down some notes regarding the integumentary system, and then we'll be finished. So let's get on with it. As a quick review, I'm going to call it my whiteboard, okay? So just as a quick review, we started talking about the layers of the skin itself. And remember, there are two main layers. This is review, so you don't have to write this down. This is just quick review from last time. Two main layers of the skin. Remember, the integumentary system includes the skin, hair, nails, and some glands. But the major portion of the integumentary system is the skin. So the two major main layers are first the epidermis and the dermis. And we talked about the 5 layers of the epidermis. I'm going to start with the dermis today. So 5 layers, I'll review that or repeat that really quickly. The five layers of the epidermis, from the deepest layer to the most superficial, is the stratum basale. Remember, that has basal stem cells and melanocytes in it. The basal stem cells are what are continually dividing to give us new cells, and the melanocytes produce the pigment melanin. The next layer above that is the stratum spinosum, and that's a thicker layer. Cells are still dividing there, so there's still mitosis or cellular divisions going on. The cells are still alive. That's also where we find those immune cells, the dendritic cells, by the way, in this spinosum layer. Then the third layer above the spinosum is the stratum granulosum. It's thin relative to the spinosum. This is where keratinization really starts to begin. And there's 2 types of granules found in the stratum granulosum. What I mean by granules, they're actually granules inside of the cells. Those are keratohyalin granules, which help form more keratin and produce the protein keratin in the cells, and also lamellar granules, which are those waterproofing granules. Then above that, if we are talking about thick layers of skin on the palms and soles, then there's a 4th layer called the stratum lucidum. It's extremely thin, clear layer, only found on the palms and soles. And finally, the stratum corneum, which is a very thick layer. That's the outermost layer. And all cells are dead at this time. It's made up of stratified squamous epithelium. The cells are dead. They're totally filled with keratin. And there's a little bit of waterproofing in that final layer as well. I didn't mention that. There are some glycolipids in that, but most of the waterproofing of the skin comes from that stratum granulosum. Okay, now we're going to go on and talk about this, the dermis. So remember, if this is the top layer of the skin, this wavy line is the boundary between the epidermis. So there's 5 layers of epidermis here in this relatively thin layer of the skin. And then all of this down here is 2 layers of dermis. And I'm going to specify those 2 layers now. So there's 2 layers of dermis, all in this very thick business underneath the epidermis. So I'm going to quickly pull up a new whiteboard. And just talk about the dermis. The first layer of the dermis is called the papillary dermis. The word papillary just means finger-like. Papilla is another name for a finger structure. So papillary dermis If we go to that wavy boundary line again between the dermis and epidermis, the papillary dermis is the layer closest to that boundary line. So it would be right next to the stratum basale here. So if this is the stratum basale of the epidermis, then the papillary dermis is just underneath that. And the reason it was named the papillary dermis a long time ago is because of those humps, those hill-like structures under a microscope. Somebody thought they looked like finger projections, these things. And they called it the papillary dermis. Now I'm going to give you some quick characteristics of this. This is mostly areolar connective tissue. So one of those connective tissues that we learned back in the last chapter, one of its locations is under the skin or in the dermis of the skin. That's this. Papillary dermis is made up of areolar connective tissue. And there's lots, it's highly vascular. So remember, all the layers of the epidermis up here have no blood supply. This, however, has a rich blood supply. So I'm writing highly vascular, and I'm just going to pull up a red pen and draw these blood vessels are in this papillary dermis layer, and they come all the way up and sort of butt up against the stratum basale. And that's where this provides, the papillary dermis provides nutrition to those bottom layers of the epidermis. So I'm just going to say provides nutrition to stratum basale and spinosum. How it provides nutrition is blood vessels always bring oxygen and nutrients to an area in the body. And because there are no direct blood vessels up in the epidermis up here, these blood vessels down here are close enough that things can diffuse out of these blood vessels up into these base layers of the epidermis. So that's how the cells like the stem cells and the melanocytes, they get their nutrition from the blood vessels in the papillary dermis. That's a major function, is to help supply nutrition to the deep layers of the epidermis. There's also, the last thing I'm going to say about the papillary dermis is there's also a lot of, sorry, that's supposed to be an O, there's also a lot of collagen. Remember, that's a tough protein that helps give our skin its toughness. Collagen, I'm going to put, and elastic fibers. That helps give our skin its elasticity. If you pull on your skin and stretch it, you know that it snaps back or coils back into position. That's from all of those elastic fibers found in the papillary dermis. All right, let's move on to the dermis. I'm going to just call up another whiteboard and list the dermis. So I'm just going to layer over this one. So layer 2 of the dermis, sorry, is the deepest layer is the reticular dermis. So the dermis is made up of 2 layers, papillary dermis and reticular dermis. This is the deepest layer of the skin. It's also the thickest layer. So back to our little picture here of the wavy line. Everything above the wavy line are 5 layers of epidermis in here. Here's the papillary dermis that we just went over. Now, reticular dermis would be deep, and the reason I'm using red is because it's mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. So all of this is reticular dermis down here. And it is mostly dense, irregular connective tissue. It makes up about 80% of the thickness of the skin, so it is by far the thickest layer. I'm just going to put 80%. There are some adipose cells in this tissue, but most of the fat, the adipose tissue, so I'm going to use yellow, is down here. This would be considered, most of the fat that we carry underneath our skin is actually below the dermis, and this is called the hypodermis. And just make sure, I usually ask this on this quiz, the hypodermis is not considered part of the skin. So actually the deepest layer of the skin is the reticular dermis. So technically not a skin layer. Hypo means below, so it's below the dermis or below the skin. I'm just writing mostly adipose tissue, which is fat. Now back up to the reticular dermis. This is also highly vascular, lots of blood supply. So it provides nutrition for all of the dermis itself to its own tissue, as well as some of the papillary dermis. It contains collagen fibers for strength. Not quite as many elastic fibers. And I'm going to leave it at that. Those are the basics that I want you to know. Reticular dermis is the deepest layer, it's the thickest layer. It's this type of connective tissue, dense irregular, highly vascular, lots of collagen for strength. Last thing I was just going to say is it connects, finally, it connects the skin to deep tissue because it's the base layer. All right. If you're not recording and you want to screenshot that, go ahead, because I'm going to move on to a new whiteboard. And just, I'm going to briefly talk about skin pigmentation. That means the color of our skin. And there are three basic things that gives our skin its color. and those are from, first, melanin, which is a pigment produced by melanocytes. You know this now. Those melanocytes, you know, are found in the stratum basale of the epidermis, that deepest layer of the epidermis. And there's two forms of melanin. One that produces a reddish yellow color, so I'm just going to write reddish yellow. The other one produces a brownish black color. And just by the way, all humans have relatively the same number of melanocytes. So we all have the same pigment producing cells. I'm just going to put the same relative number. Obviously, it varies a little bit from individual to individual. What gives us different skin color is mostly, so I'm just writing what gives specific skin color is first and foremost how active those melanocytes are. And the type, I'm going to put the form of melanin produced. And it's basically, obviously, just based on our ancestry, whether our ancestors came from sort of near the equator, people with darker skin, their melanocytes are more active, producing more melanin for protection. UV rays are the #1 cause of skin cancer, and so the more active melanin in people who live in sunny areas protects their skin, actually protects the cells in their skin. Things like those basal stem cells and the melanocytes are protected by melanin. People from areas ancestrally away from the equator, northern or super southern latitudes, tend to have paler skin. And that just means their melanocytes are not as active because the sun's UV rays are not nearly as intense in those areas. All right, there's an enzyme that makes those melanocytes, that determines the synthesis of melanin. So the process of those melanocytes making melanin is determined. So I'm just writing enzyme that determines the melanin synthesis. It has a name, I'm going to give it to you. It's called tyrosinase. Tyrosinase. It's just an enzyme that sort of dictates the process of making melanin. All right, and this is, I'm just going to layer over. If we want to come back to this one, that's okay. You can just ask me to do so. So here's the process. What happens? UV light from the sun is given off, and it hits our skin, and then the keratinocytes in the upper layers of our skin produce a chemical when the sun hits the upper layers of our skin where we have these keratinocytes. They produce a chemical that then stimulates the melanocytes to secrete melanin. And that's how it works. And then that melanin is just this pigment, this sort of gooey sort of substance, dark substance that what it does is it absorbs UV light and it absorbs heat and dissipates that as heat to protect those stem cells and melanocytes. Almost finished with this pigmentation bit. Just so you know, people who have freckles and all of us that have pigmented moles, basically freckles and moles are just an accumulation, like a local accumulation of melanin. Okay, so that describes everything that I think is important about melanin. The last two constituents that can help contribute to our skin color is something called keratin. Melanin is made in the skin, keratin is not. It's found in plants. Sorry, getting ahead of myself, misspelling words. So keratin is found so we ingest plants with keratin in them. That's how we get it into our skin. Carrots get their name because they're chock full of this pigment called keratin. So carrots have a high keratin component. So keratin is sort of this reddish orange color or yellow orange color. And when we ingest these foods that contain it, our skin accumulates this pigment in it. It really, it accumulates in the stratum corneum, which is the upper layer of our skin. Of the epidermis. And finally, the body converts this carotene to vitamin A. So it not only makes our skin, especially pale people, makes their skin sort of yellow orange if they eat a lot of it, but then the body converts carotene into vitamin A, which is good for all sorts of things. And the last thing, so I'm going to layer over the top of this and we'll be done with pigmentation. Hemoglobin is the third pigment contributing factor to our skin. This is a protein found in red blood cells. I'm sure you've heard of hemoglobin. And what it does is it carries oxygen. That's how our red blood cells carry the oxygen that we breathe in our bloodstream. But when oxygen binds to hemoglobin, it makes it turn bright red. So I'm just going to write, when bound oxygen, it turns a bright red. And that can give, especially in pale people that don't secrete a lot of melanin, that can give their skin sort of a reddish or pinkish hue. So those three factors, mostly melanin contributes to our skin color, but then carotene and hemoglobin also play a part. So I'm going to go over sweat glands, major functions of sweat glands and what they are, and then I'm going to go over a hair follicle, just so you know, since you attended this lecture, or if you're listening to it later on recording, I'm not going to ask you any questions about nails on the quiz, just the hair and the hair follicle, because they're basically the same structure. All right, so I'm going to call up a new board. And first, I'm going to talk about sweat glands. I'm just going to list the few major types. Technically, there's two categories, but there's 4 glands I'm going to list here. So let's just do this. I'll number them. Sometimes it helps students if things are just numbered. Remember when I use the word merocrine and holocrine, that refers to how they secrete things. Merocrine glands secrete by exocytosis and the cells can keep secreting. Holocrine glands, if you recall, they secrete by the whole cell rupturing and the cell is destroyed in the secretory process. So I might use those words again when I describe some of these glands. So the first type of sweat gland is called eccrine, E-C-C-R-I-N-E. These are found all over the body. They're the most numerous. First thing I'm going to say is they're merocrine. That means the cells are not destroyed and they can keep secreting. They're the most numerous sweat gland. So I just put most numerous. We find them all over the body. There's a high concentration of these on the palms of the hands and the soles of the feet. So I'm just going to write high concentration, arrow, palms and soles. We know that their secretion is released by exocytosis and the cell is not disrupted. And here's what's actually in sweat, or the secretion constituents. I just wrote the word secretion and I'm going to list some things. 99% of it is water. There's also typically some vitamin C found in the secretions of, this is normal everyday perspiration. You go outside and it's sunny and it's hot and you start to get sweat on your brow or all over your body. That's what these glands are, these eccrine glands. There's vitamin C. We also find some antibodies in normal sweat. something called dermacetin, which is an antibacterial. What it is technically is don't worry about this part. It's a peptide, it's a short little amino acid chain, but it has antibacterial properties. We have bacteria living all over us, which are symbiotic, good bacteria, but this is for bad bacteria that may cause harm. So there's an antibacterial in it. There is some waste. I'm just going to put this. Last thing I'm going to write is normal everyday sweat or perspiration is also slightly acidic. I'm going to put a star here because that means I'm most likely going to ask you this on the quiz. These glands, our regular sweat glands, are regulated by the sympathetic nervous system. We'll learn all about the different divisions of the nervous system later. All right, that's it on eccrine sweat glands. They're the most numerous. They're our regular perspiration glands. I'm not going to erase this board. I'm just going to lay a row over on top of it in case we need to come back to it, okay? The second type of sweat gland is called an apocrine gland or apocrine sweat gland. It's similar but slightly different than the eccrine. We have fewer of these. There's still a lot. There's about 2,000 of them on the human body, and they're clustered in certain regions, but we have millions of eccrine glands. These are mostly found in the axillary region, which means the armpits, and pubic region near the groin. These are also merocrine in secretion. That means the cells keep secreting and by exocytosis, and they are not destroyed in the secretory process. The ducts of these glands empty into hair follicles, not just onto the surface of the skin like the eccrine. So we find them in areas where we have pubic hair, in the axillary region and pubic region, and they become active during puberty. I'm just going to put the @ sign at puberty. They have basically the same fluid in the secretions, but then there's some extra things. So I'm just going to write same water-based secretion as eccrine glands, but added lipids, those are fats, and some proteins. So the addition of these lipids and proteins, what happens is when these particular glands, the apocrine glands, when they release their secretions with these lipids and proteins, bacteria on the surface of our body feed on these lipids and proteins. So I'll write surface bacteria feed on these, and that's what gives us our body odor, the unpleasantness. So body odor comes from, first, these in the secretions, and then the bacteria feed on those lipids and proteins and produce this odor that we have. Last thing I'm going to say about this is also activated, same thing, by the sympathetic nervous system. If you're wondering what that means, sympathetic nervous system, it's the nervous system that we don't have conscious control over, that when we're stressed, it gets activated. And you can relate to that if you've ever been stressed out and you start to sweat. That's a result of the sympathetic nervous system. Right, I'm going to quickly run through the last two types of glands. They're not going to be this in depth. I'm just going to mention them. So I'm going to layer on top and just go, whoops, let me go back. Add a board. So number 3 are ceruminous glands. They're basically modified apocrine glands. And we find these only in the external ear canal. And the secretion of these modified apocrine glands is actually called cerumen. Well, the secretions combine with sebum. So I'll write that out. To form cerumen, which is just what you and I call earwax. And finally, number 4 are mammary glands, which are most active in females around the time of giving birth. These are specialized sweat glands. That produce milk. When you take AMP2 at the very end, if you're going to take AMP2, the second half of this year-long business, mammary glands are discussed in detail in the reproductive systems, which is the last thing you study in AMP2. So I'm going to stop here because those are addressed later in AMP2 course. So that I've gone through all the glands now. 2 more things and then we'll call it a day. I'm going to review hair growth and a hair follicle, and then I'll open up to any questions you want at the end, okay? So I'm going to call up a new whiteboard. I'm just writing hair and follicle. Follicle just refers to the structure that the actual hair grows within, inside of. So the follicle is like the cavity that the hair grows in. And there's some great diagrams in your book. And just as I'm thinking of that, just to remind you, everything that I go over here in these online lectures is just to assist you, help you figure out what you think or that I know is most important, and help you guide you in that direction. It doesn't take place at all if you're reading the book. So I get it. It's great that you guys are showing up to these lectures. That is one of the most important things you can do to succeed in this course. But the other most important thing is to read the book, read the chapter. So don't just do one or the other. Try to do both, and you will have a much greater chance of doing really well in this class. So the hair follicle, first, this word that you and I call hair, the scientific term for a single hair is pili, P-I-L-I. So that word means a single hair. It's mostly, I'm going to draw a hair follicle in a minute. It's mostly, a hair is dead keratinized cells. and they contain a much harder form of keratin than our skin does. Keratin is just a very tough, hard protein, just to remind you. And our hair cells, it's a harder type of keratin than in our epidermis. It's a bit softer in our skin. And the regions of a hair, this is just language. There is a medulla, which just means the center core. Of a hair. The cortex, which is outside of the medulla, but it has a thickness to it. And finally, the outermost region is called the cuticle, but it's very thin. The cuticle is where most of the hard keratin is. So if we were to just draw our hair, I'm going to pull up different colors just arbitrarily. I'll pick green for the medulla. That's the center core. And then the cortex is outside of that. It has more of a bit of a thickness to it. And finally, the cuticle, I'll leave that in black, is sort of this outer covering right here. Now I'm going to draw an actual hair follicle and label all of the parts of the growth of a hair and the pieces of the follicle and how it's all interrelated. There's great diagrams in your book. You obviously don't have to draw this. You're not going to have to draw anything on a test. I'm just going to ask you about all these constituents on the quizzes. So I'm going to add a whiteboard here and just label this a hair follicle. If this is the surface of our skin, the follicle itself goes down pretty deep into the skin. Now I'm going to draw this wavy line separating dermis from epidermis. So everything above that red line is epidermis and everything below it is dermis. The curious or interesting thing about this hair follicle is the wall of it, the epidermis extends way down around the follicle like this. I'll color it in. So everything that's red is epidermis, the 5 layers of the epidermis, and the epidermis extends, making up basically the wall of the hair follicle. So it invaginates or goes way down deep into deep layers of the skin, just in the area of a hair follicle. So these are the 5 layers of the epidermis, and therefore we call this the epidermal or epithelial sometimes. Some books call it epithelial sheath. Okay. Now I'll use blue. Everything below here, this is all dermal tissue. So you know that that's the deepest layers of the skin. So I'll write dermis. to give you a reference. And that means both layers of the dermis, the papillary dermis and reticular dermis. Now the dermis does this, it's deep in the skin, and there's an area at the base of the follicle where dermal tissue sort of penetrates up into the base of the follicle like this. So I'm going to make that blue. And that little finger-like structure or thumb-like structure that's sticking up into the base of the follicle is called the dermal papilla. So I'll label that. I'm going to use black just so you can see it. So the dermal papilla is, I'm running out of space down here. It's just the portion of dermal tissue that sticks up into the base of the hair follicle. Now the hair itself grows around from the base of the follicle. The hair does this. So what I'm drawing is a hair that protrudes up out of the surface of the skin. So we see the shaft part of the hair protrudes up above the skin. The part of the hair below the surface of the skin, right here, we call the hair root. And finally, the portion way down here at the base is called the hair bulb, B-U-L-B, and you can see why, because it's shaped, it's bulb shaped. And it's in the bulb area where new hair growth actually occurs. So way down at the base of the bulb, right on the border line, I'm going to use yellow just because I haven't used it yet so you can see it. There's an area right here that's called the hair matrix, like the movie, The Matrix. And I'm going to label that. This, what's so special about the matrix? I'm going to star it. This is where my cellular division is going on, where new cellular growth is. It's sort of similar to the stratum basal in the skin. So I'm going to label that up here. That star, the matrix, is where we get new cell growth and division. And there's a blood supply, you know, there's a rich blood supply in the dermis. So there's blood vessels that go up into this dermal papilla that supply nutrition to that matrix, just like the papillary dermis blood vessels supply nutrition to the stratum basal layer, the epidermis. So it's very similar to the layers of the skin. And in the hair matrix, oops, I thought I had black. In the hair matrix, it's where new cell growth, there are stem cells there, so we get new cell growth. And we also have, guess what, melanocytes that give our hair its color, its pigmentation. So I'm going to put plus melanocytes. Those secrete pigment and give hair, our hair, individual hair, its color. And just like the skin, the basal stem cells give rise to new cell growth like this. And they're constantly dividing. That's why our hair is constantly growing in length. So the new cells that form come out of the hair matrix, and as they push up, as they get pushed up toward the surface, they die just like our skin cells. So the hair cells down here, I'm going to color them black when they're still alive. And then they quickly die as they go toward the surface. Totally dead cells make up most of the hair itself. That's why it doesn't hurt when we have our hair cut, because They're dead cells. There's no nerve endings. There's nothing. But you know that if somebody pulls on your hair, tugs it, that hurts. And the reason is because of the attachment down here at the dermal papilla. That dermal papilla not only has blood vessels in it, there are nerve endings as well as vessels that when somebody pulls on that hair, it hurts from stimulation of the sensory nerves. And sometimes if you pull a hair, a drop of blood can come out of the follicle, and that's because you rupture some of those blood vessels down in the papilla. There are two more structures that before I shut this down, there's two more structures that I want to add to this. So I'm just going to erase a tiny portion, hopefully, of the blue right here. And I'm going to add a gland. Since I haven't used green, I'll select green. Associated with every hair follicle on the human body is something called a sebaceous gland. And a sebaceous gland it's not a sweat gland, it secretes sebum. S-E-B-U-M. That is a lipid-based oil secretion. And so the cells, the secretory cells in this gland, they secrete this oily-based substance that makes its way into the follicular space, the follicle space of the hair. So this green is sebum, this oil-based substance, and it helps moisturize the hair and the skin surface around it. So I wanted to, and there's one last structure that I need to draw in here. So I'm going to do a little bit of erasing to clean this up. Erase some of that dermal tissue. And I would use red. What I'm going to draw is a small muscle. And usually I use red when I draw this, but because I use bright red for the epidermis, I'm just going to use black. There is a small smooth muscle associated with every hair follicle as well. I'm going to give it lines so that it kind of looks like a muscle. So this thing is called, I'll name it, an erector pili, P-I-L-I, muscle. This is a smooth muscle. That means we don't have conscious control over its contractions. It's a smooth muscle associated with every hair follicle, and it attaches from the wall of the follicle down here to the surface, below the surface of the skin up here. And when it contracts, it causes our hair to stand up on end. So what's the point of that? Well, it's for temperature regulation in most mammals. So when our hair is standing up, it helps trap a layer of warm air close to our skin. So you've experienced this. You go outside when it's really cold and you don't have a jacket on and you get goosebumps. What goosebumps are actually dimples on the skin from this erector pili muscle contracting all over your skin, and it's causing your hair to stand up on end and trap warm air close to your body. So it has a warming function. Mostly in other types of mammals like dogs, cats, or wild animals, these muscles contract and their hair stands up when they're threatened as well. When they're frightened or threatened, that gives that animal an appearance of being larger than it really is. So those are the main structures and functions of a hair follicle. And I'm going to ask you questions on the quiz tomorrow about that. Before I cut this off, I'm just going to review really quickly. I mentioned these the first time that I did a lecture for the integumentary system. And they're basically the 5 or 6 main functions of the integumentary system. So I'm going to go over those in a little bit more detail now, and then I'll shut it down, okay? So I'll save that board in case you want to look at it at the end. I'll just layer over the top. And I'm going to review integumentary system functions. These are overall functions. Just to give you a little bit more detail. These are there's probably more than this, but these are the main ones. The first one we listed before was protection. I'm just going to talk about that for a minute. The skin provides a chemical barrier. What that means is the secretions that come out of this, the chemicals that come out of the skin help in protection. Like, for example, melanin is technically a chemical that's secreted by melanocytes that provides protection against UV rays. There's also antibacterials, microbials in chemicals that are secreted. So I'm just going to put from secretions. Antibacterial, melanin. There's a chemical barrier. It also provides a physical barrier. You know that. Helps keep us waterproof from water from getting in. It helps damage to our internal organs and tissues by providing a physical barrier against bumps, scratches, abrasions. And finally, it provides a biological barrier. I'm just going to write immune system function. And then I'm going to draw an arrow. Those dendritic cells that we mentioned the first day, those immune cells, help provide an immune type of function. So that was just a little more detail on protection. I'm going to write a number 2 here and just write temperature regulation. There's basically 2 main ways that it helps regulate our body temperature. Cooling. It can cool our body by sweating. Every time we secrete sweat in those merocrine sweat glands, those eccrine sweat glands, when that sweat evaporates off of our bodies, it's a cooling process. Also, the blood vessels that are closest to the surface of our skin, I'm going to put from sweat and from vasodilation. So when the blood vessels that are closest to the surface of our skin dilate, that releases heat. So that's a form of cooling. And it helps conserve body heat by vasoconstricting vessels that are in the surface of the skin. I'm going to put vasoconstricting surface vessels. So if we restrict the amount of blood flow toward the surface of our skin, that conserves body heat. Also, the erector pili muscles that I just described to you that help hair stand up on end. I'll remind you that these are smooth muscles. We don't have conscious control over them. All right, so that's temperature regulation. Let's just do a few more. Don't worry, it'll be quick. Add one, sensation. I'll put a number 3. Just all this means is that we have nerve endings in our skin that sense the external environment. We have all different types. There are temperature, they're called exteroceptors. We have tactile Merkel cells that sense touch. I'm trying to be quick because I know that you're probably about done with this mentally. So number 4, I'm just going to write the word metabolism. Believe it or not, the skin does have metabolic functions. So UV light on our skin causes our skin to produce vitamin D. There's an inactive form produced by the skin, and then it actually gets converted to an active form by the kidney. Number 5, the integumentary system can act as a blood reservoir. So it's a place where we can store some of our blood. And finally, the last one, number 6, excretion. You know that our skin now, our integumentary system, the glands excrete all sorts of things. So I'm just going to put, can excrete fluids, everything in that sweat that we listed, as well as there's some waste products. All right. I think we covered just about everything that you need to know, the major topics in the skin chapter. I'm going to shut down the recording first, and then I'll answer any questions you would like.